Life for me as a very young kid was very hard, very disturbing. At about 6 years old, I was molested by a family member, and I went through and I started going through many different things in my life as a young kid um, because of what had happened to me. You know, when you're around family, they're supposed to protect you and look out for you and love you. And I just thought that this was something that was common. And this happened for seasons in my life. I was very young. And because of this, as I started rebelling and started doing things, and that wasn't all that was going on at my house at this time. My mother was cheating. My father was cheating. I remember one night my father chasing my mother around the house, and the next night, my father chasing my mother around the house. I mean, this was happening on a continued basis and stuff within my family. I was the youngest out of five. I had two brothers and two sisters. And finally, it came to a place where my parents got divorced, and I sat before a judge, and he had asked me basically who I wanted to go with. And my family was so broken that I couldn't answer him who I wanted to go with because of all the things that were going on. So he made a decision for me to stay with my mom for a season. And that's where things started getting out of control for me. I had to be about maybe about 7 or 8 at this time. I started, taking off. I started running away. Started causing a lot of havoc within my mother. Well, my mother couldn't deal with me anymore, so she shipped me off to my father's. And my father had moved from Whittier to the city of Rialto, and so because the gangs were so bad in Whittier at that time, he thought it was a good idea for him. And my parents had gotten divorced and stuff. So he moved towards that way, and ended up going with him because my mother couldn't handle me anymore. And my father was never home. He used to work, long hours, and then if he was home, my father was a womanizer, so he'd bring different girls home, throughout the week, and then sometimes on the weekend he wouldn't be there. And I had to be about 12 years old at this time when all this was happening, and I had nobody. My brothers had each other, my two sisters had each other, and I had nobody and stuff. And I was looking for love. There's this old cliche, you're looking for love in all the wrong places. Well, I started looking for love in the city of Rialto. There were some kids that were up the street, and they did the normal things, play football, basketball, different things like that, you know. And, so eventually I started going out and hanging with them and stuff. And, but on Friday nights, a few of them would take off, and they would always invite me, to go with them. And you got to understand that, my father was a big man. My father was like 6'4", 370 pounds and stuff, and if you would act up, man, he would put a bout to you. So this was always in the back of my head, not to do anything wrong, so my father wouldn't be upset at me. But the time eventually came and stuff when my father wouldn't come home on weekends, and so a Friday night I'm going with these individuals. And one thing that really intrigued me is that, these guys had bald heads and tattoos, and it seemed like everybody feared them and respected them. But, and they would hang out at the parties kind of like in the corner, but there was a brotherhood and they were always together, and this is what I saw from them. And, I wanted that. It seemed like, they cared for each other. It seemed like they had each other's back and they looked out for each other, and, so eventually on Friday nights, I started hanging out with them. And unfortunately, there was an accident that happened in the city of Rialto and stuff. And, you know, uh, there was a car accident, and they had a memorial. And I went to the memorial. And then after that, we went to reception. And I remember, like, at this time, Southside Rialto was the biggest gang in that city. And I remember there was many members that were there at the reception as well. And I wanted to get jumped into the gang. I'm 12 years old, and uh, you know, uh, I got all this rage and anger and all this different stuff going on with me because, what had happened to me as a young kid, and then I felt left out and abandoned. I had nobody, and I saw this within the gang that they had each other. And that's what I wanted. I remember we're there, and I remember we started taking pictures, and in one of the pictures, I threw up a gang sign. And back then it was the Polaroid films. And I remember they developed the film and they started shaking it. They started passing around to one another. and stuff. And the next thing you know, I remember I got a hit. I got hit from the side, and I remember falling and getting up and fighting with two guys, and then calling out people, "Hey, come on, let's go! Come jump me in!" I remember we went to a house across the street, and I ended up getting jumped into that gang, and that kind of started my journey within the gang. I was young at this time. I wanted respect. I wanted, notoriety within the gang, and whatever I had to do, I wanted to get it, because I look at the older guys and how much respect, they had, because of different things that they did, and that's what I wanted. I wanted all that, what they had, I wanted that too, and stuff. So, that became my journey. Within the gang, I started, committing crimes as a young kid. I started, running around with guns. I started, stealing cars. Started doing robberies. Holding up people, all this different stuff. I was getting busted in and out of the juvenile facility. Camps. Went through YA real quick and stuff as a young kid. You know, and things got so bad for me. I remember one night I was coming home, and I had to be about 16 at this time, 16 or 17. I came home and I came in the house. I remember my father being on the floor. My father had remarried at this time and stuff, and I had a stepmom and a baby sister. I remember my father had a shotgun, and he was saying, "Son, they're here, they're here, they're calling your name. I think they're in the backyard." I remember I had a couple of my homeboys with me, and we had guns, and we ran into the back. We didn't see nobody. I came around the front, I flipped on the light switch, and a rival gang had spray painted 187 on my garage, and it had my nickname under it. And when 187 means there's going to be a murder. So a rival gang came to my house that night looking for me to kill me. But I wasn't there, and my dad did the best thing he could, by grabbing a shotgun, taking the family in the front room, and preparing himself. And that's how it was for me in the neighborhood. Things got so bad for me, as a kid or whatever. I remember the police pulling over my homeboys, and telling them, telling them, well, where's he at? Where's he at? You need to let him know that the rival gang's got a green light against him, and they want to kill him because of all the stuff that he's doing in the neighborhood to them. So that was my life as a young kid, and eventually I ended up going, into the prison system. And I remember going into the prison system. My first night in prison, I'm right there in the East Yard in Chino. I have a bunkie, and I remember, like, I felt tension. I felt a lot of tension that day, but I wasn't sure what was happening. And next thing you know, I heard a lot of people. It's a wooden floor in the gym, so I heard it sound like people were running. And at first I thought they're coming for me, but they're coming for my bunkie. They end up stabbing my bunkie and stuff. And then somebody pulls me and takes me. He said, "Hey, you got to go with me. Go with me into the back. Otherwise, they're going to try to get you for this." So I remember I go into the back and stuff. We're on the floor. I remember the COs are shooting like these pop guns, these BBs that come out and they shoot all over, right? And I remember getting rolled up, by the correctional officers and going down to a Sally port and stuff. And I thought to myself that day in prison, I said, whatever I have to do, I'm going to have to do, because there's no way I'm going to die here in prison. And eventually I ended up getting released and going back, to the neighborhood. And in 1997, I was released from a lockdown facility. I believe it was Soledad and stuff. And I went to my neighborhood. I wanted to party, see my homeboys. There was girls on the next block, and I remember going over to the next block, seeing them. I heard some noises in the bushes, but I just thought that, the noise, I didn't want to trip on it, because, I'm out, I'm solid, I'm good, or whatever. But eventually, when we jumped in the car that night, a guy jumps out of the bushes, puts a gun to my head, and shoots me in the back of the head. I turned quickly. One of the bullets went in the back of the cab of the car, and the other one in the back of my head. I ended up getting rushed to the hospital, and I ended up dying. And I remember going into this dark place. And it was crazy, because I remember there was something behind me pushing me into the deeper darkness and stuff. And there was this quenching fear that came over me and stuff. And it was really crazy. It seemed like the deeper I got into the darkness, the greater the fear became and stuff. And I heard people. At first, I thought it was people laughing and rejoicing, but it was actually people screaming for help. I remember one guy that was in the deep darkness was saying, "Help me, help me, help me." And then I woke up. I woke up and I knew that something had happened to me, but I wasn't too sure what it was. But I didn't tell nobody because I thought people would be like, "Oh, you're tripping," or we don't believe you. So I kept it within myself, and I ended up going home a week later and stuff, from the hospital, and eventually I ended up going back to prison. And this time when I went back to prison, I started hanging around with these guys, and I didn't realize these guys were part of something called the Mesa, and that's a table where they receive instruction from the generals or the Mexican mafia. And I'm sitting there with these guys, and thinking to myself, well, these guys are good guys, strong guys, confident guys. But I remember them handing me some paperwork, and on the paperwork it said, Southsiders, and it said Sureños on it. And they said, well, who are you? And I go, well, I want to be a Sureño. They said, well, put your name right here. And I didn't know what I got myself into that day. I remember some guy bringing up paperwork as well, and some stuff had happened or whatever. I remember them sending a kite to the back. At that time it was Palm Hall, and there was, a big homie in the back. Anyways, about a week later, we received another kite. And on that kite, it said that, this individual that brought us the paperwork, had to get off the yard, had to be cleaned up and stuff. And I remember the guys telling me, well, what you got to do is, you got to keep him close. You got to walk the yard with him, friend him and stuff. And eventually, you're going to have to hit him and stuff. So, eventually that time came where I hit him and stuff. And those things happened, transpired and stuff. And, it was a big old mess. A big old mess happened and stuff like that, and, eventually, I ended up getting out of prison later on and stuff. And then I ended up coming out and stuff. And then I went back again. This is 2005. I'm trying to condense the story as quick as I can. I went back to prison in 2005, got pulled over by the Colton Police Department. They said they had a whole bunch of charges against me, this and that or whatever. Ended up going back to Chino. I'm sitting there, and at that time there was Arnold Schwarzenegger was a governor, and he passed something called the Miranda Act. If they didn't see you within 45 days, then they got to kick you out. So I'm sitting there, thinking to myself, what's going to happen? I'm done. I'm washed up. That's what the police said. The police said I was never going to get out and stuff or whatever. I'm sitting there on my 45th day and stuff. And I remember telling the CEO, so what's going to happen? She said, you know what, Martinez? I have no idea what's going to happen and stuff. And so anyways, I remember sitting there in my cell, working out and doing different things, keeping busy. And then I received a kite. I received a kite from the Mexican mafia that said that somebody that was there within that pod had to be whacked and killed and stuff. So I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm good, cool, I'll take care of it or whatever. And I remember that night my cell popped open. It was the CO, and she told me that I was getting released. She told me I was getting released, and I thought it was a mistake. Somebody messed up. I ended up going to the bus stop, going to see my mom. 2 days later, I end up in a Christian men's home, giving my life to the Lord and stuff. And that was 20 years ago. And it's crazy to think about the things that had happened to me. Had God had called me, and wiped away all those things from my life. And I'm still serving God. It's been 20 years, and I have to say it's probably the best decision that I ever made. The best decision I've ever made. My name is John Paul Martinez, and I am in the city of Whittier. Thank you, Soft White Underbelly.